Thanks everyone for your patience as I kind of got oriented to this system. I've never used Hop-In before. I hope everyone's having a fantastic day with CRISP Student Advocacy Day. My name is Rachel Forbes, and I am a social worker in Colorado. I'm with the Graduate School of Social Work at University of Denver. And I am the program director for the Western Colorado program. So I live up here in the mountains. And I've been on the faculty with DU about 13 years. I do environmental justice work. So that's what they've asked me to come here today to talk to you all about, is what is environmental justice? How, as social workers, can we work to advocate for environmental justice in our communities? And so that's a little bit about what I was going to talk about today. So I was hopeful to hear from you all just to get a sense of who is in the room, where everyone is joining from. If somebody wants to just, I don't know if you can unmute your microphone. I was hoping to see folks, but I don't know if that's a possibility. I just wanted to get a sense of where people are coming from and what their home communities are. So feel free, anyone, to jump in. Looks like we have Buffalo, New York in the house, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Another nice, Michigan. Okay, so all over Arkansas, Baltimore, nice. Howard is in the house. Okay. So, yeah, this is a little different because I was hoping to see everyone. So I'm going to try to facilitate this as best as I can. But my question for you all to get started was, how many of you all are already doing environmental justice work in your communities? Is anyone already working on environmental justice issues? Someone said, not me yet, unfortunately. Okay. So I would imagine that probably the rest of you are just curious about environmental justice work as it might relate to social work. Elizabeth is saying that they would love to hear about ways to get involved. Someone else saying not officially. Okay. All right, well, we can just start with the basics then. So environmental justice, what is environmental justice? I'm sure you've all heard the term before. The definition that I'm going to share is the one that we use with the Council for Social Work Education. So CSWE is the accrediting body for all social work programs at the bachelor's and master's level. And they set the competencies for what do we learn in social work? You know, what does the social work curriculum or what does a social work educational program look like? And so I am the co-chair for the Council for Social Work Education Committee on Environmental Justice. And we were formed maybe like in 2013, I want to say. We were asked to get together to start exploring what environmental justice is, because, you know, historically, environmental justice has not been taught in social work programs, right? So there's probably like a couple of you that have had environmental justice content taught in some of your MSW or some of your BSW courses, but it has not officially been ingrained into social work historically the way you might hear about economic justice or racial justice or, you know, obviously one of our ethics, social justice. So it's kind of, even though we've been doing environmental justice work as social workers since the beginning of our profession, right? I mean, if you think about the founders of social work, you know, with the Whole House movement, I mean, they were working on sanitation issues, right? And they were looking at trash, and they were looking at sustainable development and housing. So there were people doing environmental justice work since the roots of our profession, but it hasn't really been solidified into our profession, especially in our educational competencies, until much more recently. And so, so going back to the Committee for Environmental Justice, CSWE asked myself and a couple others to get together to come up with a definition for environmental justice, and then use that definition to embed it into social work programs. So that way all social work programs now have to start assessing in their curriculum for environmental justice content, which is awesome because it basically legitimized environmental justice as a core competency for our profession and something, crucial to be teaching students. So the definition that we came up with for the committee, which is now in our EPOS, it's in the competencies for all social work programs. And it states that environmental justice occurs when all people equally experience high levels of environmental protection and no group or community is excluded from the environmental policy decision-making process, nor is affected by a disproportionate impact from environmental hazards. Environmental justice affirms the ecological unity and the interdependence of all species, respect for cultural and biological diversity, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. This includes responsible use of ecological resources, including the land, air, water, and food. So we kind of hung our hat on those 4 pillars, right? Looking at land issues, water issues, air, and food. So maybe we can use the chat and just have some folks chime in and think about what are some issues surrounding land, air, food, or water that you see in your home communities that may be considered an environmental justice problem that you could advocate for as a social worker. So anyone just feel free to jump in on the chat or unmute yourself and we'll hear from the group of what those issues might look like in their communities. Oops, I was muted, sorry. So someone's talking about river cleanup in general and water problems. Absolutely. If we don't have clean water, we don't have so many other things that our communities rely on for our health and well-being. I mean, look at the Flint water crisis, right? That's a man-made disaster, an environmental injustice that we as social workers need to be involved in. Other issues regarding land, air, food, or water that you see in your home communities, intervention opportunities for social workers? Okay, so someone's talking about food deserts, right? So exactly, Kendra just chimed in, food deserts. So if we don't have good food in our communities, right? I mean, which are, again, it's a man-made disaster. We don't have the opportunity to have, healthy communities. Someone's talking about teaching nutrition education in low-income areas, and food deserts are real and affect the learning and behaviors of these people. Absolutely. So these are, when we think about systems, like we think in systems as social workers, this is a large scale problem, right? It's not just one community that doesn't have a couple grocery stores. I mean, this is, someone's talking about corporations not taking a responsibility to close the consumption loop. Absolutely. Like we need to advocate at multiple levels to make sure that corporations are held responsible too. Any other issues that you see in your communities related to food, air, land, or water? Oops. All right. So we have someone talking about chemical plants in low income areas. Absolutely. So when we talk about toxic communities and dumping, I mean, polluting industries like extraction and petrochemicals, they recklessly pollute the air, the water, and the land of certain communities that are deemed quote unquote, expendable. So, I think that these are communities that we mostly see in social work that are either low income or, communities of color. These are communities that are more at risk to, you mentioned chemical plants being put into these communities. And so I think that as social workers, we need to be able to go in and say, you know what, that doesn't belong in any community. It doesn't matter, the race or the income. We don't want that in our backyard either. So, when we think about it, for decades, especially communities of color, Black communities, Indigenous communities, they've lived with the brutal legacy of environmental racism. And so when we think about places like Newark, New Jersey, in the South Ward, we can think about Cancer Alley in Louisiana, the East Barrios of Los Angeles, Navajo Nation. Polluters have poisoned these communities with toxic chemicals for a long time, impacting the air that they breathe, the water that they drank. And then when we link that to health outcomes, these communities have faced disproportionately high rates of asthma, cancer, and a lot of people turn a blind eye. And I'm so glad that Shannon brought up corporations, because, while corporate profits grow, the health and the well-being of the families in these communities decline. So again, social workers need to be at the conversation, when we're talking about how do we not only prevent these issues from growing, but how can we solve them since they're already happening too. So let's see, Kendra's talking about light pollution. I don't know a lot about light pollution, but I think that that's something that I would be interested in looking more into. Metro Detroit and Detroit from Elizabeth, the building of roads that divide communities. Yeah, I think transportation is another one that Patty mentioned. And when it comes to justice, transportation justice, that's a really good point. When we think about like some of these roads that come in, who are the communities that are displaced? It's usually like, the communities, again, that have less of bargaining power when these decisions are being made. All right, let me switch to my next slide. Sorry that you can't see them, but I can make sure that Amani has the slides. Maybe she or someone else from the organizing committee can email this out to you all. I only had, so the next slide was what environmental justice issues are prevalent in your communities, but we kind of talked about that already. And then the last slide, since we're talking about advocacy today and policy, I wanted to just put one piece of legislation on your radar, and it's the Environmental Justice for All Act. And let me see if I can actually copy and paste these links into the chat. Whoops, can I type these in? I don't think that I can. Hold on. Oops, I don't know if that's working. Oh, well, if you just Google the Environmental Justice for All Act, it's just something that I wanted to put on your radar. So it's a bill crafted by the people and for the people who need it most. It reflects the realities and needs of environmental justice communities, and it's grounded in the idea that all people, no matter their race, origin, or socioeconomic status, deserve clean air, water, and land. And so it's actually the most recent significant step that Congress has ever taken to remedy the toxic legacy of environmental racism in our country. And it addresses the disparate impacts of environmental justice issues on communities of color and those who are low income. So if you look it up, like I said, it's something that I think is, it's historic. I'm obviously rooting for it. Oh, thanks, Amani. And I would just make sure to pay attention to this bill. And it's something that definitely we should be advocating for as social workers. Under the provisions of this bill, communities would have a legal recourse to demand justice for these environmental issues. It would strengthen the National Environmental Policy Act to make sure that we are having federal agencies who are taking communities who are impacted into consideration when we talk about like permits for new projects, again, holding corporations responsible. So it would also make sure that we consult with tribal governments, because again, when we talk about like impacted communities, a lot of Indigenous communities are the ones who are impacted most when we think about like a Keystone Pipeline was like a big one, a couple of years ago when we talked about like, who's getting displaced and whose waters are getting polluted, right? Like this bill would make sure that we are actually consulting with tribal governments before those decisions are being made. The bill would also amend the Civil Rights Act to make sure that certain groups can hold polluters accountable when projects use federal funds or resources. So that's another big step. And then somebody mentioned, Patty was talking about the building of roads that divide communities. So When the federal government wants to build or expand a highway that would bulldoze through an existing community and increase the air pollution there, or greenlight, for example, the construction of a chemical facility, these communities would then have the tools to fight back under this bill. So again, it's a really powerful piece of legislation. Follow it, support it. And as social workers, again, I think that this is one great step forward in the right direction when it comes to codifying environmental justice into law for our communities who are most at risk. So that's all the slides that I had today. Like I said, I was hoping that it would be much more conversational. I apologize because, I was not used to this platform. I thought maybe we could have some Q&A or some back and forth conversation. Shannon was asking, do you think it will pass? I'm not sure. I like to hold hope to think that it might, but it's a pretty bold piece of legislation. So it might not, in the sense of it might need to be worked on for another year. We have someone joining in. Nice.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be on camera. That was an accident.
Oh, that's okay.
But nice to be here.
Hi. You're welcome to stay on if you don't want to. That's fine too. This is the environmental justice presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Right on.
I just came from my small breakout on Zoom.
All right. So any other questions or comments from the group? Feel free to unmute yourself, add your video, or type into the chat. I'm happy to share my contact information. Let me see if I can chat. This is my email address. You can contact me at any time. I love talking about environmental justice issues. I love supporting students who are just getting their feet wet, trying to just orient themselves to this work. I didn't bring up climate change today, which is like a whole other thing, but I think that in terms of the next thing for our generation moving forward, obviously climate justice is something that we're all going to have to start thinking about more broadly and more collectively. I don't think social workers do enough in the climate change space, but we are the ones who respond to the hurricanes when it comes to providing mental health relief in the face of a disaster. That's all climate change related, right? I think that we don't talk about climate change enough. And so that's a whole other presentation. But if you're interested in climate change initiatives or climate justice initiatives that social workers can be involved in, I'm happy to share about that too. Paul was asking, can you tell us how you entered this field? Yeah. So when I got I did my MSW in New Jersey. That's where I'm from. I went to Monmouth University. And I did a very macro program there. So they had a concentration at the time that was called international and community development. And it was this hyper macro concentration where it was really looking at global issues, right? And so I got really involved with global sustainability issues at that time. I did my internship with the International Federation of Social Workers, the IFSW, at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And so I was involved with a lot of international groups, NGO advocacy groups. It was really awesome to see just how all the different countries were coming together to look at things like immigration or women's rights or disability rights. So probably one of the most macro placements I feel like you could have as as an MSW student. It was really eye-opening. And so I kind of got hooked on doing macro social work, early in my placement as an MSW student in my second year. And then when I got out of social work school, I was hired on to do some curriculum development work out here in Colorado for a community college that was just starting a bachelor's program in sustainability studies. And so 10 plus years ago, sustainability was kind of the buzzword, and everyone was buzzing about sustainable this and sustainable that. And now I think everything's kind of shifted to be more justice focused, which I think is more appropriate. And as a social worker, I think that's the direction we need to go in. So it's kind of less sustainability, which I feel like a word just got that word got co-opted by so many groups, it's everything's sustainable all of a sudden, it felt like. So now everyone's kind of shifting to ecological justice and climate justice and really centering equity in the work. And so it's kind of come along, in many different iterations, but yeah, I got cut my teeth doing, sustainability work. And then, it just kind of shifted into environmental justice work. Where I live up here in the mountains of Colorado, I live in a very, very rural community, right? And so a lot of the issues that I see in my community are centered on environmental problems. For example, like we have fracking in our community, which is really awful. It's an extractive industry to create energy, but it poisons the water, it poisons the air. It's really, really disruptive to community. So that's like one issue that I became aware of when I first moved out here from Jersey. And I was like, whoa, like I had no idea what fracking even was. And it's all over the place where I live. And so that's kind of one of the issues that, really oriented me to environmental justice work. So that's like a long answer, Paul, but that's kind of how I got into it. And it's just kind of evolved over time.
I have a question to follow up on that, if you
Sure.
don't mind. Sorry for the background. I'm in the airport, but what is the role of social workers to mediate? We were talking about fracking, and there's this push for Biden to increase the amount of oil we're pulling out to make up for the Russian oil exports that we were getting prior. What is social workers' role to be like, hey, that actually might not be a good idea because we're gonna have very serious environmental impacts?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's one that I get a lot from students and even from like seasoned social workers that are like, okay, but what does climate change have to do with social work? And like, why should I care? And even if I do care, what do I do about it? Right? Like, how do I vocalize this and put language to it? And I always just tell people like, we are the justice experts. Like we are the justice warriors. We do that work. And so when you're thinking about energy development, whether it's from natural gas or big oil pipelines, you have to start thinking about like who's being negatively impacted. Like what are the justice issues at hand? Is it, this community because they're too poor or they're too low income to advocate? Is it this community of color? Is it this community who's been historically just marginalized decade over decade over decade? So I think you have to start thinking about like development, but at whose cost? Because there's always going to be somebody who's getting the short end of the stick. And it's oftentimes the same populations in social work that we work with across the board on other issues. So I think you just have to keep centering, for me, keeping like social justice at the core of the conversation, because when you think about public health and land use planners, and when you think about energy developers, I mean, they don't care about social justice, quite frankly. Like that's not even like a concept for them. So I'm usually, even if I'm working like, on an interdisciplinary team, when there's energy people in the room and land planners in the room, I'm always the one being like, hey, but what about the social justice implications, right? So you kind of just have to keep raising that up for people, because oftentimes it's the bottom line, it's deadlines, it's this, it's that, but it's never people's health and well-being. And I think as social workers, you just have to keep voicing that, because, people need us too. Great question. Thank you so much for asking that. Somebody's talking about climate change. Exactly. And the impacts of climate change on immigration, poverty, disease, so many things. Like I said, I think that like we're kind of late to the conversation as a profession. I think social workers have a little bit of speeding up to do when it comes to being involved with climate justice conversations. But I'm telling you, these are the same populations that we're going to be worked with, when it comes with disease, or somebody mentioned migration. So we just need to keep centering that work. Harrison said all of these things are social justice issues. Absolutely. I could not agree more. So yeah, I just encourage you to, keep your ear out for environmental problems in your communities, and just know that social workers have a place and a role to play in these conversations. Any chance that you have to advocate when it comes to climate justice centered initiatives, know that again is a social justice and a social work issue. So you're at the right place. And I'm just grateful for your time, and thank you for being here. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day for Student Advocacy Day. And I'm going to type my email address in one more time, because I love hearing from students. So like, honestly, you can email me at any time. If you're graduating and you're thinking about a career in this field, I would love to talk to you. There are two really awesome resources that I would connect you with. One of them is this group on Facebook called Ecologically Conscious Social Workers. It's a global group. It's a public group, and it's fabulous. It's a conversation, kind of ongoing, people sharing resources, ideas, trainings, fellowships, jobs. So that's a really good one. And then there's a listserv that's, I don't have the email address right offhand, but there's like a listserv that's run out of UNC Greensboro. And it's, again, just the same thing that you're seeing on the Facebook group, but it's just another way to connect with like-minded social workers that are doing environmental work. So I would definitely encourage you to get on that listserv too, if this is stuff that interests you. So anyway, that's all that I have for today. And Amani, I don't know if there's anything else that I need to do, or if I just sign off. Thanks again for your time, everyone.